Hello and welcome to EdTech Talk's continuing discussion of Dave Cormier's new book, Learning in a Time of Abundance. This week, Chapter 2, Abundance. And you know that's important because it's in the title. We're going to cover song lyrics, online recipes, Uncle Eddie, and more. I am Jeff Lebo in Busan, Korea.
My name is Jennifer Madrill, and I'm in Chicago, Illinois.
This is John Schinker. I'm in Still, Ohio.
And I'm Dave Cormier. I'm in Windsor, Ontario, Canada.
Wow, so much smoother than last week. Good job, team.
It's better. You gave us some good cues before we started.
Before we
Thank you.
get into the book, any weekly updates? What was your week abundant in this past week?
I got nothing.
Getting outside a little bit, garden stuff.
Yep,
Got
building gardens.
Yeah, lots of stuff. You were building gardens. I was planting gardens.
Yep.
Do you guys have jobs?
Not on the
We
weekend.
did those too.
Yeah, lovely weather here as well. Nice hikes. I did include this week in one of my class tasks, we were talking about generations. And so I had my students fill out forms. My generation is, my generation is not, my generation likes, my generation does not like, worries about, and views on other things, which I may weave into our discussion.
Did you play the Who song?
I did not.
As you were talking about their generation?
They would roll their eyes and, say, hey, boomer. None of that.
Roll their eyes.
Although I have to say, like they have an appreciation for different eras of music.
That's good.
Mm-hmm. And a lot of their cafes will have old vinyl and be playing old tunes.
I brought my kids out to see bluegrass on the weekend. Speaking of old music.
Fantastic. What did they think?
It was Molly Tuttle and the Golden Highway, so it's kind of new bluegrass, and they're in a stunning band. They're unbelievable. So talented. So the kids were right into it.
So they thought that was good.
Yeah.
Not dad's old weird music. But your kids don't think you're weird, right?
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, sure. I mean,
do they? Oh, okay.
Well, they embrace the weird.
I mean, you got, I was gonna say
we are all self-identified as just a little different. So we're on the same side of the
apples don't fall that far from the tree.
No.
Well, either that or you guys do a great job on social media because it always looks like they're having a good time when you take them
Bonnie does take an excellent set of photographs.
Yeah.
She does.
All right, Jen.
Oh, right.
So are we still talking about this same book?
We are. And I started looking at chapter 3 today. So it's a good thing I remembered that we hadn't done chapter 2. So I could go back and prepare questions for the right chapter. But so as Jeff said, this topic is about abundance. And so I think it's a good place to start kind of where you did at the chapter, talking about kind of comparing and contrasting kind of the two main categories of abundance that you start talking about. So I'm going to kind of lead the witness here a little bit. Material abundance versus abundance of information. So take it away, Dave. Kind of where do you see this, and like how did you kind of come up with that distinction as a way to frame the chapter?
So that comes from Glenn I from 74. He makes a distinction between material abundance and information abundance. So material abundance is maybe there's a lot of it, but it's still finite. So in a sense, like you could have lots of coal in Ohio. I don't know if Ohio is coal, but there's still a certain amount of it, and so that like it's materially attached. Whereas when we talk about information abundance, I mean, you could make an argument that the server uses energy or whatever, but at the end of the day, you could put up one newspaper article and 1 million people could read it, or 100,000 people could read it, and it doesn't make it less. Like you don't lose it; it doesn't decrease. And I think
doesn't get exhausted through consumption.
It doesn't get exhausted because lots of people looked at it. And so it's an initial distinction that seems to be really important in the abundance conversation, because the first thing that people do when you start arguing or start presenting things like this is they go, whoa, what about this? And much like everybody always says, what if we trained our doctors this way? So that's just it's a critical distinction, because when we think of abundance in the sense of like food in the world, right? So we clearly do a terrible job certainly in our countries of managing the amount of food we have versus the amount of food we eat, right? There's an amazing amount of it that gets thrown out. And other parts of the world that don't have access to the same abundance of food, but we just can't like move ours there, or I mean, we could. It would be better if we did. but it's harder, right? Because it's attached to things and it's physical, it moves around. So that distinction ends up being the starting point of the discussion there, so that we're thinking about how just how it's different than things like food. That was a terrible explanation.
No, it was great. And John, what you mentioned is what I put in our little show notes is that, the abundance of information to me, kind of my takeaway is that it's not limited by how many times we use it. So, which can then kind of contrast to scarcity, right? I think you kind of talked a little bit about scarcity. Is there anything you want to say about scarcity now? Or you want to kind of wait? Okay.
I mean, the thing that occurs to me is that information, not only it's unlimited, but the more it's consumed, the more abundant it becomes. The more likes something gets, the more proliferated it becomes.
That's interesting. I never thought of it that way.
You kind of did. You sort of did. Well, you talked
I?
about like social media, like we all then have
Okay.
interpretations of the information, right? That then kind of feeds the beast a bit. Is that kind of what you're getting at, Jeff, too, a little bit?
Yes.
Yeah, material abundance is never going to be viral, right? Like, so
Right.
like it's never going to self-propagate itself in the way that Jeff is talking about. So I think that's a really interesting sort of look at it, because it means the more it gets looked at, the more it gets looked at, which with material abundance, that's never going to be the case. For sure.
Okay, so all of this then to me is a good time to talk about the implications. So abundance sounds great, right? What's wrong with abundance? So why don't you spend a little bit of time helping us think through kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly of abundance and kind of those implications and trade-offs?
And that's when you hang on the material abundance ends up being different. So one of the examples I use in the book is going to a barbecue. And so when you walk into any kind of barbecue, and if you're taking a pro-social look at this place at all, you're going to look around how much food there is, who's there, whatever else. If suddenly there are more people, then there are space for food. You end up in that material scarcity sense where you're like, oh, maybe I should only have one of those things, and I'll only have I'll have a hot dog, but I'll share it with Jimmy, or whatever you end up doing. So you deal in those scarcity kinds of ways. Whereas when there's clear there's a certain amount of abundance, you got a choice to make. You end up sort of deciding based on maybe what's healthy for you, maybe what you're going to be seen as doing. It may be the kind of place where people eating lots of food is very cool. Maybe the kind of place where it's considered respectful to eat more food. And there's certainly cultures where that's true. But there you end up with a whole social set of rules around that, right? Where you're doing that. And so for me, what's happened with information abundance is we've gotten to the point where we have changed the relationship that we have to the amount of information, right? So when I was talking to Ren, my eldest, about going to university, and I was talking about going and wanting to study history. When I was 17 years old, I didn't have history books in my house. I didn't have access. If I wanted to know who the second emperor of the Roman Empire was, there's no way for me to find that out. I couldn't. I mean, there was no library in my community. There was no, I mean, I could have driven to the nearest city, walked into a library maybe, or walked into a bookstore and tried to find a book that was about that, and then flip through the book to try to find a list. It's hard to even imagine how hard it was to access information. Now that draw towards discovery just isn't the same. So when you look at, for instance, and I don't have evidence of this, but I believe it's true. When you look at so Beth McMurtry just released an article in the Chronicle today where she was talking about how hard it seems to be for students to care about going to school, and how much there is this sort of, I think part of that is that, like my students have told me, I don't have to come to class to get the information. I can just get it at home. I had one student in engineering who's like, I don't even bother. Like I show up because I have to, but I don't pay attention because frankly, my professor is so bad at explaining this. It does much better when I get home. I just need to know what the topic is. And then I can go home and watch that guy on YouTube that I always watch, and then I'll get it figured out. Right. It totally changes the relationship between teacher and student, right? You were the only option before. So good or bad, you were the only option. And that relationship has changed, right? So you no longer as a teacher have control over the content because they have that abundant access. And doubly different, you also don't have control over truth. So they can, yes, go home and read the same thing that you were talking about, but they can also go home and read the opposite opinion of the one you were talking about that's equally cited or equally positioned. They don't have to believe you in the same way either. Now, you could kind of do that with a library before, but that's real effort. Now I can be the worst slacker in the world and still check up online and find out that my professor there's a different opinion than the person saying they walked in the door. So I think all of those impacts end up being things that we don't have new plans for, right? We don't have, at least that I've heard of, or in any agreed way, an idea of how we're going to, for instance, generate interest in students for going to school to learn rather than school to credential. Jeff, you're just on the tip of your finger.
I'm so ready to go because I think, like, I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, but I feel like what that student is experiencing are my optimistic answers to the challenges you're talking about in this book, because he's right. I don't think it makes sense to go to a physical space and listen to some human lecture for 60 minutes about the history of the Roman Empire or anything when there's so much better resources out there. But I do think the role of the human and the reason to go somewhere is to address what is true, to help moderate that. Students can be exposed to that information. The role of the human can be, okay, let's come together, let's discuss it, what is valid, what's not valid. Like, there's still a role for human in that, but lecturing is, so unnecessary for the most part at this point.
That's the abundance
saying
literacy right there. How do you filter? Like, how do you get through it? How do you manage the fact that there are 27 opinions about this and sift your way through it to come up with some kind of decision? Sorry, John.
Well, I think the other piece of that too is that you can find the arguments to reinforce whatever you want to believe. I was in second grade publishing parties today, which are all the second graders wrote books about nutrition. And so they had to pick 3 foods, and for each food that they picked, they have to give like 3 reasons why that food is good for you. So this kid chooses broccoli and it's high in fiber and it has vitamins and it has antioxidants, and they're explaining all this stuff. And like it only takes 3 things, right? That's what an argument is. You have 3 things to support whatever you're saying. It's really easy to find 3 arguments for anything. And so you pick what your position is, you go out and harvest the abundance of information to reinforce whatever your viewpoint is. And you don't have to listen to the 4,000 reasons why you're wrong.
But that's where the education comes in. Like, that's where the system or the teacher should be helping to facilitate. All right, let's get those counter arguments going. You found those 3 facts. You found these different 3 facts. Let's sort it out.
Is that what we teach teachers to do?
Not currently, but I feel like that's what we should be doing if we want a job.
I wonder what change you'd have to make. Like, I mean, I'm certainly trying to do this in my own BED courses with my students and trying to get
You
to
certainly have to change how you measure learning. And then change how you measure schools.
And I think you come up with a better definition, because forever, students have just been coming up with those 3 arguments, spewing it out, and there hasn't been the give and take as much. Now it's all about the give and take.
Yeah.
Or it should be, or could be.
The food one is hilarious too, because this morning somebody was telling me about vitamin C again, and how that it actually doesn't help anything related to cold. It's actually not related in any way that anybody seems to be able to discover. And though you could find 100 people online telling you to take it, to do it. So is that the citrus industry that was driving that in the first place? Like, how did this thing start in the first place? It's good for scurvy, apparently. Is that still true? And I think we end up in a situation where you can make anything true. And I think that's the real scary part about this, because I care less about the kid getting the second Roman emperor question right than I do about the kid being able to make good arguments against the white nationalist person who's trying to recruit them. Right? That's the piece that I'm particularly interested in, is giving people the tools they need to be able to see through some of these things.
Like, a significant slice of my social media consumption are people like Dr. Is, who is a doctor and like mediates these conversations. This person said this, here, I'm going to share the research. This is what the verified research says. And there's this back and forth in the nutritional social media space that is what I think education can be. Even if you don't find definite answers, at least let's bring it in, let's discuss. You try to convince me that your facts are better than I hate to say your facts are better than other person's facts
This
because
is where it gets tricky. This is where it gets tricky. It is fine when there's an easy path to discover what the actual fact is. It's fine if there's actually a truth out there. If there isn't, if it's something that is always going to be contentious or is always a factor of debate, or where there is research evidence in both directions, then what do you do?
that's where the premium is. That's where the educational institution can gain reputation, is by people trusting that they have looked at all the different perspectives and come up with something that is commonly seen as, okay, yeah, that makes sense by the biggest number of people. You're never going to convince everybody, but I trust Dr. Is
Why do you trust this person?
because A, he's got the credentials. He is a doctor, and he doesn't always. I see John already questioning that. Because I like the way he takes the information. He says this part's true, this part is not. This one we're not sure about. Like, he's not black and white, and I'll have to think deeper about why I trust him. And I don't 100% trust him. I want to see other people as well, but I trust him more than a lot of the other loons that come across my feed.
How do we decide a loon from a not loon? I don't.
He's going to help you make a better decision, if not the
Right.
best decision.
Right.
And I think that's another one of the qualities of abundance, right? Like if you've only got two choices, you're picking one or the other. If there are 473 choices, you want to be in the top 20% of possible choices, right? You want to not make the terrible one. And if the person helps you get a little bit better down the road, that's good. But again, our whole school system is based on things being right or wrong, right? Almost everything in the K-12 school system is about it being right or
Yeah.
wrong. And then first year, second year, third year, depends on where you are. It depends on your program. It depends on a lot of things, but still there's an awful lot of it that's just, you did this right, you did this wrong. Which again, I don't think is a very good tool. Not that there aren't facts that we out there, but for all the rest of those things.
I think
Yeah,
we
which
talked
is
about what the one class I taught the spring, and we talked about it in the context of the literature review, which is one of their major assignments. And I think you could take the way we write literature reviews and take those into a lot of different types of assignments you could have students work on to get to this whole idea of analyzing information, finding it, sorting it, coming up with contrasting takes and opinions and research that's been done. And that's why I think it's kind of fun to watch the students, because their inclination is they are going to start with a thesis, because I think, first of all, everybody thinks they know a lot about a topic when they start, or they have some like what they consider foundational knowledge. But usually what happens is you start digging into what other people have done in the research or whatever, and you realize, oh, wow, there are different ways to look at this. And the cool thing about a lit review is that you start and you do your analysis, and then you toward the discussion section, come back with your own arguments. And I think that's what you're saying, Jeff, is like you like with the person you follow is they do that process. So I think what's kind of interesting is like take that whole, like I said, example from that one assignment that I have my students do, and think about how that translates to how we bring that into what we're trying to get folks to do in general when they walk out the door of whatever class they're in or whatever, is that they have those skills. And as a segue, that I didn't mean to build it in as a segue, but I think it's a good one to what you talk about in the book, is the difference between information and knowledge, right? And there's a quote that you've got on page 49 that for folks that have the book handy, that information is the raw material you have to work with, but knowledge is information put in a package by a person or a process. And so I think, Jeff, that's what you were saying, like you rely on that person to help process that. So what I think is really the interesting conversation for educators is, how do we do that? And I don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, but to me, a lot of this gets into like literacies, information literacy, and how those types of things. And you use the word literacy, but not completely. Maybe we will get to that later. But so what are your thoughts on that, Dave? Is that whole idea, can you give us a little bit more context of what you were thinking about between information and knowledge, and then if you want to get into the literacy type stuff?
It's funny you say that, because I'm working on a talk for tomorrow right now about the difference between being information literate and then being fluent. And the example that the New Zealand government's project uses is somebody who's literate in the water doesn't drown, and somebody who is fluent could stop someone else from drowning. Like is comfortable in the water, diving, whatever else, is able to make interpretations and a whole bunch of other things. And I really love that distinction. And I think it's a really important one because one of the things with Gen AI, for instance, if you are not fluent, you can't tell if it's true or not. Right. So it's really great for somebody who is looking for something inside their own field because they can look at it quickly and go, nope, nope, on the rest of that's fine. And off they go. But that's not ever how, that's almost never how it's going to end up being used. It's almost always going to be used by people who are not or barely literate in whatever field they're talking about, right? Because otherwise, why would you go? So it's expert usage I'm not worried about. I mean, I have some concerns about bias and like stuff that I think is important to talk about, but overall, I'm not as worried about it. What I am worried about is how people take information at face value and don't do the sort of processing to get it to knowledge, right? And that is in an abundance landscape. It's everywhere because if you're going to a library to go find something out, you've taken your bike out of your basement, you've put on your helmet, and you've gone down the road, you've found a place to lock the bike, you walked up the stairs, you walked in, you found the part of the library, you go and find the book. And by that point, the extra work of looking at 2 more books is a very small part of the process that you're engaged in. Whereas for me to go, answer, it takes twice as long to look at the second one. Right. In the first case, it's a very small fraction of my time that I've spent in trying to find this thing out goes to doing the confirmation work. Whereas it doubles the work for every point of confirmation whenever you're working in sort of the internet. And so I think we don't bother to do that extra cross-referencing, the extra, like they say, the lit review part, like all of that sort of deeper approach to it that's more about meaning making. Why would you? And I think our students really don't. Because they've never seen any need to, because they can just find whatever information they want.
Is that true, Jen? When they're doing their lit reviews, do they just like find an answer and they're done, or are they seeking out different views?
Well, how do you know when you're done with a lit review?
Well, that's a big question we often have. It's like, where do I stop?
Because you could spend the
Yeah.
rest of your career working on the lit review.
100%. And so a lot of times that's a scope issue. I'll say, then let's narrow it. That usually is a sign. You were looking at the issue like this for the purposes of the confines of our class. We're
Or
gonna
maybe
like
it's an
this.
abundance problem.
Yeah, right. Exactly. So the way
Because
we
your
handle
scope ends up
abundance
being
is
super narrow.
we have really tiny scope. But what I guess my biggest challenge that I have for them is don't start with a thesis and then go find sources to support your thesis. That's not what we're trying to model. But and maybe I'm just a bad teacher, but the process part is hard. The synthesis is really, really, really hard. There's this idea that if they get it in a research study, they'll just keep quoting that they'll say so-and-so said blah, 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 blah. Whereas, if you've kind of been in this for a while, you like talk about the thing and then you'll cite it. Like that's but you don't like give the authority to that person for coming up, it's just an idea. And so they have this idea that if it's a scholar or an academic, then that means a ton. And, so they have this idea that, I don't know if they get it in we've talked about this before too, a reputable journal. Some are more reputable than others, and that we can have long conversations about that. So those to me become almost like information literacy things. But I think that to me is really, really, really hard to teach, is how to decide where you put all your whose eggs you put in your basket, I guess is maybe a way to think about it. But I don't know. What have you thought about through this process idea, Dave? Is how do you get folks on a path toward analyzing and synthesizing this information effectively?
I think so much of it is just the amount of time people are willing to commit. So I was doing a talk on Friday for our the arts college attachment to our university, and the person who teaches sculpture was talking about how she's struggling right now to get students to sculpt for longer than 20 minutes. And there's always this, kids these days and whatever else, but in this case, it's an attention issue. right? So they'll start to do it and then they'll look at her and go, is this done? And she's like, is it? I don't know. It is your sculpture. And so she's finding that there's a suite of things that affect this. That part of it is an unwillingness to master discomfort, is how she described it. That her students seem to be very hyper aware of their current state of physical wellness, and they sort of have structured this language of breaks that's like 5 or 10 years old and didn't exist before at all. People just wouldn't. And like she says, I'm not saying that's bad, but they won't persist, and they don't seem to be able to manage their attention. And I think that that's one of those critical pieces, right? So if your relationship to information acquisition is a 30-second process, the idea that I would take all this time to go through all this, like, it's TLDR, like, just tell me what it is. Just let me know. And I find that that's the biggest challenge, because I've seen the same thing that you have. It's written in a journal article. It must be true.
Mhm.
No. And I
Yeah,
actually don't buy the whole like better journal stuff at all. But I still think that it's just a process. There's no magical wand that's happening. It's a human who went through a process, and you can understand and trust that that process happened, but that process has its own strengths and weaknesses.
yeah, and it's okay to. I think they're all thinking that there's got to be a right and a right, like a two. Too long didn't whatever. What does it stand for? I say the acronym.
Too long
all the
didn't
time.
read.
Yeah, I was gonna say
Too
the
long didn't
acronym.
read.
Couldn't say it out loud or say the whole thing. But anyway, the idea that it's okay to, and it's a good thing actually. You're providing value within your lit review to be able to say that there are contrasting opinions and there are contrasting findings, and that those are things we need to dig into more, because there is this idea. Well, I'm writing a paper and I'm coming to my conclusions, so I should have conclusions that are answering the question that I'm trying to seeking. And it's like no, it's actually okay to say this needs to be looked into more, and these people disagree.
Somebody had
in these
that
ways.
problem with a book recently where he spent the first 6 chapters asking questions and then had to find a way to answer a couple of them.
So let me ask you guys a question then. So you guys are all curious people who do all kinds of different things. Do you find that there are more things that you're meant to decide? Like, do you find that there are a lot of things to decide about, like positions on, like coming at you in different ways? So for me, one of the challenges is that I'm expected to have an opinion, not on 10 things, but on 1,000 things. And so I think part of the other thing that happens is that because there are 1,000, I just start putting them into boxes because there's too many to deal with. Right. So if you're out functioning in public, if you're sitting by yourself in your basement and all you're doing is watching Netflix and whatever else, then I don't think this is happening to you. But if you're sort of out functioning socially, I find it challenging to deal with people who are asking me why I don't care about the fact that where the new hospital is going in the city, why we're not using fourplexes in my city. There's a whole suite of these arguments, and I'm approached as if I'm expected to know, like somehow I had access to all the research, which I do. I don't know where it is, but I have access to it, and somehow I'm meant to be informed about all of these things, and I just can't. Right. So the defensive mechanism that I had to come up with was to say, I have no idea. It's not that I'm not interested in this thing that you're very passionate about, because the other response is, I don't care, which I think of as disrespectful. You clearly care. And I'm trying to listen to you, but you're not explaining it to me as if I'm somebody who doesn't know. You're explaining to me because you expect me to know. And because it's your thing. And maybe you and your 5 close friends are always talking about it, so you expect that everybody knows this thing. But for me, there are hundreds of those. Does that resonate for you guys at all?
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
How about
It's
you,
actually
Jen?
why I'm quite uncomfortable even doing like presentation keynotes, anything like that. It's because I think the more you start to dig in, you realize how much you don't know about the thing, whatever the
Mhm.
thing is. And so you almost start to kind of panic that I don't want to say anything because there's so much more I don't know. Kind of getting back to what you were saying, John, is like when is enough, and what is the right thing. But yeah,
And it's both a matter of uncertainty and not being sure because you haven't looked at all of it. And also, that there's somebody out there who just wants to fight, right? They just want to argue. And they can find 50 counter arguments to anything that you say because there's an abundance of all of the perspectives.
Yeah. And that is the consequence of abundance is the information is
Mhm.
out there, it's accessible. So we could have an opinion if we cared. And I think there's a spectrum between I don't care, I really don't care, versus I don't know, but I'm interested in learning, versus I do care and I'm somewhat informed.
Well, and we
And
can't be experts on all the things, even all the important things.
Almost
unless
none.
we're 20 years old.
That's right. So this argument's only whispered at in the book, but this is where I think the rise of the demagogue in the last 10 years has really come from. Is that people are looking for guidance because there's so many damn things for them to think about. Sorry, John's car from 10 years ago. I didn't mean to use bad language. I know that John really objected to my language many years ago. But I think there's so many things for people to know about. All they want is somebody to just take some of that off their plate. And when you mix that with the fact that we're accustomed to having people in positions of power, teachers, have the answer to things, and that's how we're taught to relate to knowledge. You put in one loud, obnoxious, terrible old man, I won't mention any names, and people are just like, it doesn't matter. It doesn't even matter if what he's saying is true. It's just I can follow that. And I don't have to process. Now I've been told what the right thing is, as opposed to having to negotiate my way through understanding the ways in which gender has changed as a relationship to culture. Just like, oh my God, can you just not tell me what it is? And why do you guys keep changing your mind about what it's called? I'm not saying that I'm aligned to that, but I understand the frustration. There's a great article, I wish I could find it, that came out after the 2016 elections in your fine country, that was talking about people who were not going to be rewarded by the policies that were coming in. They were poor people who were not going to be helped by this process, who felt like they had been left out of the conversation and were looking for something, some kind of answer. And I think that's where this stuff becomes really important, is that something very significant has happened to the way we come to decide things in our world. And I mean, schools are important places, but that's not even the, if any of you are ever unfortunate enough to read the entire book, it's not really about schools. It's about learning and how important it is that we understand how we decide things, right? Because it used to be that you were pretty safe making random decisions on because there's such a narrow process and they came at you seldom enough that you had time to catch up with them, or your opinion wasn't going to impact anyone else's. So if you, like Tommy from my hometown, won't mention his last name, but who is an awful man and had terrible opinions, was only really influencing the 6 people on shift with him, right? That's where it stopped. And so his awful opinions just, they were there. Whereas now, like you said, Jeff, it magnifies and expands and magnifies and expands, right?
And I don't think the human nature behind all of this has changed. I think we've always wanted simple answers, whether it's in zodiac interpretations or the local shaman or to some extent religions. I think the fact that we're expected to know so much more about so many more things, and we're having so many knowledgeable people tell us what's the truth, that is new to this. I've always been a devout I don't knowist when someone asks me about religion, and I'm comfortable with that. But I think a lot of people are not.
You don't have to know all the things. You just, if you decide to not know all the things, then you have to trust somebody else. And then take their view of what the things are and what to think about them. And a whole lot of people do that.
And what we see is people aligning not even with the answer, but with the person.
Right.
So we're in a number of counter protests, people who are protesting a variety of trans issues in their K-12 school system. And the stuff that was being shouted at us and the several disagreements I had with some of the people in the protest were clearly not, they were party line repeated expressions. In any actual question about what they were talking about, there was no content to it, right? There was just a veneer. It was just membership. It was belonging, not knowledge seeking, but just belonging.
And it's not even really about the issue. It's about you're not part of the group and I have to hate you because of it.
That's right.
Yeah. And by the way, you had a quote in the book along these lines. Let me just quote back
Right.
at
I
you.
guess it's not
Let me quote
surprising that I
back at
mentioned
you.
Please tell us, Hermione.
So
it.
we have no one to turn to help us decide what we should be doing now that we've moved from information scarcity to information abundance. And so when I read that, I was thinking about like my parents when I grew up in the 80s. We would sit and watch Walter Cronkite. What was it? CBS, ABC, and NBC. You had three choices in the evening that you sat down and had your like literally watched, had your TV tray watching TV with your, and maybe they would cover what, 10 stories. So your whole view of the world was based on, whichever one you picked of those three here in the United States. And then that became like our collective understanding of the world. And now, to your point, you can confirm your bias in any way you want to, and you'll be able to find all kinds of places to go do that. So I'm just stating what my observation is. I don't know the answer. Obviously, I don't know if anybody knows the answer to this, but I think that gets to what you're speaking to in the book, right? Is this idea, who do we go to, and how does that matter to us as educators and members of society? Go ahead, Jeff. Sorry.
I'm curious, who do we go to individually? Who do you
Good
trust?
question.
Lots
How
of
do
different
we-
places.
Because I'm sure we all feel like we get, I mean, yes, other people, they're overwhelmed and confused, but I get reliable information because of what?
Well, sure. And then the algorithm will feed you as you look more of the things. So yeah, so it's almost like a struggle to go find the things that I don't necessarily, my beliefs don't necessarily align with as I start reading it.
I made a conscious effort, I don't know, 5 years ago, 8 years ago, to try to find balanced news reporting. And so I landed on Associated Press and Reuters, New York Times, to some extent National Public Radio. And what I realized very recently, and I blogged about this last month, was that all of those were on the media bias charts, all of them were right in the center, and now they're all left. Like they've all moved left. And my theory on that is there's so much crazy stuff on the right, it's pushing the mean. And so like everything has shifted. If you want balanced, you're comparing, Mother Jones to OAN, and the center line is way further right than it used to be. So I think balanced is difficult. I think we need to have multiple sources. And I try to avoid the things on the edges and try to stay toward the middle. But it's not something that is as cut and dry as I go here for my news and I get an unbalanced or unbiased source. And apparently I have gestures on.
Yeah, I saw that. So this week, I was building outside of my work time. Thank you very much, Jeff. And I had to figure out whether or not the new pressure treated lumber was actually safe for eating with vegetables. Okay. So there's a fact in there somewhere, maybe, depending on whether or not the research has been conclusive. And there's a lot of sort of carryover. So the first thing I figured out is that the newer pressure treated lumber, which I had some suspicion of, and actually there's a lot of talk like this in the book, and if this talk doesn't sound good to you, please don't buy it. Which is just me sort of going through, here's the story that hopefully gives you a sense of how this thing goes. So, because when we go to find something out, it's never like the way that it's set up in a classroom. Here's this question, go to find it. You got a morass of different things, right? So I had this sense that there was a new kind of pressure treated lumber. which I then tracked down and figured out that there is. And the old stuff ended in arsenate, which I'm assuming is bad. And the new one doesn't. So right on the surface, I'm like, that's different. The new one doesn't have anything that sounds like arsenic in it. So that's getting better. I then reached out to John, and asked him what he thought, because he had done a similar thing and seemed to have used pressure treated lumber. Not that I could tell from the pictures, but I guessed.
did.
And he confirmed that he had. And then he looked at it. So I trust John to search this thing. So that's another building of trust. I read a couple of journal articles about it, where people actually did some testing over time, figured out what they were looking for, which is the copper in it. I didn't know that copper was poisonous, but apparently it can be. And so I figured out that in the research that's there, people say that no one's ever been able to observe any of this particular thing translating into vegetables in a way that could hurt anybody. So that's not, it doesn't, but no one has found it. And then on the websites, all of the websites of the people who sell it say, we think it's safe, but we do advise you not to do it, which I'm assuming is a legal distinction. And so that's the map that I have, right? So I'll read some journal articles. I read some Reddit articles, but for this kind of thing, Reddit's not great, because you just end up with a bunch of people shouting back and forth. It's only good if people actually drop the links in, which in this case I couldn't find any. And to me, that's how I do stuff now.
All right. So A, that is definitely not going to fit into a 60-second clip. B, on my I don't care, I don't know spectrum, that's way toward I don't care. But if ever I do care, I'm going to trust Dave, because Dave has done the research. So, and I find him to be a generally trustworthy guy. So
Dave
I may take you
trusted
up on that
me,
later.
and I realized as Dave was talking that I also did that research and forgot that I did it. Because once I made the decision, I moved on with my life. I remember asking my dad, who is a master gardener and does all of this stuff and is also a woodworker, and he said, "Yeah, don't worry about it. But he's also, going to be 80 in a year, so he's not thinking long term about things that could kill you 20 years down the road." So
And as far as trusted sources, a follow-up on why I like Dr. is because he embraces the counter argument, because he takes the criticism. This person said I'm full of BS because of whatever, and he addresses it. So I value that engagement. And like I seek news sources kind of in the middle, and like I miss the old point counterpoint reasonable argument, which is so hard to find in a
can you ask Dr.
non-combative
Is about the
way.
pressure treated lumber thing?
I will. I'm not sure he's going to grab onto that, but I like DW News. It's German news. And I find it kind of very informational, and this point, that point. I'll watch, I certainly watch a lot of what would be considered left of center news, but I also watch Al Jazeera.
Me too.
Hmm.
I like Al Jazeera, actually. What you
Just
can.
just to close the loop, what kind of lumber did you use?
Oh,
It was pressure treated. Yeah. I
Okay.
I'm sure our listeners were left hanging there. I
They-
appreciate that.
They would have come back next week
Yeah.
just to find out if we followed up on
Tune in next week.
To see
it.
what
When
he-
we'll find out if Dave's family is dead.
Okay, we got what, 15 minutes left or so? Not quite.
I
Our
wanted to
little-
talk about recipes and thank Dave for
Oh, yeah.
SeriousEats.com, because it
yeah,
addresses
it's great.
like, you how do you make whatever? And there is not just is this reliable information, but is this annoyingly presented? Like, why?
Hmm.
Don't tell me about everything behind. Just, I want the recipe. That's all I want. Why are you putting it? Why do I have to scroll through so many ads?
recipe. Jump to recipe.
Yeah.
Tom and I just had that conversation. He's like, "What? This recipe doesn't have jump to recipe." I know, annoying.
So Serious Eats and oh God, what's his name? I have his cookbook.
Kenji Lopez Alt.
Benji. Yeah. So he does what I think of as science. So he will take 12 frozen steaks and cook them under the best same conditions he can. Thaw it, half thaw it, cook it on high heat, whatever else, and try them all out. And then what he does is shows you the results of it on whatever cross reference he can find. So the weight of it, his ballpark figure on how well it tastes, and whatever. So what he's done is shown you the process of his experiment, shown you the results of his experiment, and then hands it to you. So you can, it's not necessarily a conclusion, not necessarily deciding what's right, but running an experiment that allows you to go, oh, I am definitely going to go for the cook from Frozen, which is the answer that I pulled out of that, because of whatever reason, whatever I'm going in for, because it's transparent, I can understand the process and I can actually react accordingly. So they do great stuff. Love Serious Eats.
Kenji does a podcast, and they've been going through. They just started a few months ago, and they've been going through like simple things like macaroni and cheese and pancakes, and like really basic stuff, and like coming up with how do we do these things. And one of the things that he got called out on were pancakes, because in his book he describes this ridiculous process for making pancakes, and they're fantastic pancakes, but you have to create a pancake mix, and then you're adding buttermilk and sour cream, and it's this like use all of the dishes in the kitchen kind of thing, and take all morning to make pancakes. And he said, yeah, I actually don't make those pancakes because I have other things to do with my life rather than make pancakes all morning. So he then said, well, what's the trade-off? If I don't want the world's best pancakes, but I only want to spend 20 minutes making them, here's what I do. And that's the kind of stuff that they do in the podcast, which is pretty cool. How do you make macaroni and cheese with 3 ingredients in one pot and have it come out pretty good?
So he becomes a trusted source, and I am holding out hope that the system, like I feel like truth seeking is sort of a bell curve. You're going to have the people who just want raw meat, and they're going to seek out information that supports that, or I want overcooked, well done meat. But most people, and that's probably not a great metaphor, most people want some kind of, reliable information. And so Benji has earned your trust by doing research, showing you his process, engaging with criticism. And so people trust him. People generally trust Wikipedia. There's going to be, that's the premium, I feel like, the sources that have earned the trust of the bulk of the people.
But the problem is that for a lot of people, that's Joe Rogan.
He dissects a whole bunch of really complicated things into it. Jeff, your 60-second soundbite. He's a master at being able to.
And if you've ever tried his hash brown recipe.
Yeah, and I do think that's the problem too, is, you said we've all kind of said versions of this, but Dave, you said, how do you get your students interested in spending the time necessary to do this? I was also going to say to you, Jeff, I think the greatest thing I could do as a teacher is to create a bunch of people or everybody who walks out the room feeling that they could be that, the person you were saying, your trusted source, that they should have the skills to be able to do that. That's one kind of comment I think is kind of an interesting thing to explore. But the time, we're in a time frame where people want their stuff quick, and people who can serve it up saying, here's your answer, this is what, and then get enough people to think you're an expert at it. That's been the formula.
People, they have 999 things that they have to decide on after this one. Like, I don't blame them for wanting it quick. And I think that's the thing that a lot of the pushback here is, let's move slower. We need to calm down. How does that happen? Like, how
has it ever?
I think part of the path is the one that Jeff is talking about, is just like, I don't know about the thing you're saying, and it's very interesting. I'd like to learn more, and learning that language. Peek ahead to chapter 6. More importantly, I would like to make it very clear that Jeff got an answer to a question in chapter 2, and I just want to put it because clearly SeriousEats.com was the answer to a question, and I would like to make it clear that there are answers somewhere in the book for some people.
Is this Jeopardy? Are we supposed to guess the question? Where should I go to find my reliable recipes? I would also like to talk about song lyrics.
Oh, yeah.
You talk about being in the basement, trying to interpret phrases from Edmund Fitzgerald. And I think we've all been there, of misinterpreting song lyrics. I thought Little Red Corvette was pay the rent, collect.
So you just had the lyric wrong, let alone like what the interpretation of
And, you know, last week we were talking about change is never a bargain and kind of settle, well, change is never free. Like, do you lose something?
Yeah.
I feel like what we've gained in this era outweighs what we lost because I did
Just
a
around
unit,
lyrics.
yeah, or around songs and engaging with
Mm.
music. Because I did a unit a couple years ago during COVID on Olivia Rodrigo's Driver's License. Are
Yeah.
you boomers familiar with this song?
Oh yeah, for sure.
It is just the quintessential 16-year-old heartbreak song written by a 16-year-old. It's just beautiful songwriting, great tune.
Yeah.
And the way people have engaged with this song, you know, there are all sorts of like alternative versions written from the perspective of the boyfriend or the blonde girl or the driver behind the driver. And it's all funny and clever and engaging. So like the depth of understanding of the song, or if you ask the Swifties, like their level of engagement with the music, I don't think has been harmed because they can easily access the lyrics.
Wow. I feel like you've made a very controversial claim.
Bring it on.
Well, I've never heard anyone make it before. So the in vogue position is that all this stuff is wrecked music. From the way that auto-tune has impacted it to the way that you know, people get attacked online and all the rest of this business. That community approach that you're talking about is really cool. I think that saying that they're all positive is probably wishful
I didn't say
thinking.
they're all
Mhm.
positive. I just said that the depth of appreciation and understanding of music has had lots of benefits. There's been lots of gains there.
Yeah, I think it's one thing that we were talking about this 15 years ago, but I think one of the things we forget is how much that was super banal that happened before we all knew that it was out there. We've always had sort of random, banal, bad thoughts about things. It's just now they're all recorded. Although less so now, because again, social media is not what it was 10 years ago. People don't post as much as they used to. But yeah, I guess I can see what you're saying, Jeff.
And there's
Um,
even an engagement with physical things. Like you ask any K-pop fan here, and when the new album comes out, they want the physical stuff. They want to hold something. So it's not even like a whole digital life. It's they still want the material possessions and the community interaction. So yay, change.
Yay. Things are
Yay.
getting better.
Mhm.
And
Let's fix
and like
the
what
world.
about, I mean, your kids and their level of engagement with music? Do they appreciate music less because they don't have to struggle to figure out the lyrics?
This is for someone who is passionate about music, this is the most unbelievable time. Ren's knowledge of music is astonishing. Um, was it? I'll give you an example. I was out back on the weekend, not during my work time, working on my outside thing, and Ren comes out and goes, "I have to stop you." I'm like, "What? I need to play this for you." And Ren plays me this. This was just released by Motown in 2006. They recorded it in 1966. Like, okay. And can you figure out who this is? And I'm listening. I'm like, I can't figure out who this is. And Ren says, that is a 16-year-old Rick James. Did you recognize the guitar playing? I said, no. And they said, it's Neil Young playing guitar. And the bass player is the bass player that eventually is from Buffalo Springfield. This is the Mynah Birds. The Mynah Birds was a very short-lived band that was formed because Levon Helm
All right, this is not
saved
going to be a
Rick
60-second clip
James
either.
from Levon Helm saved Rick James from a bar fight, and then Joni Mitchell suggested that Neil go on and play with Rick James in the bar that Levon took him to. And this is what I get from Ren, right? You just can't.
Sometimes abundance is awesome.
Or sometimes abundance is awesome. Like sometimes it's awesome.
Hey, can that be the new book? The next book? The sequel?
Sometimes
Sometimes
abundance.
abundance is awesome.
Oh, Jeff, I just have to throw my thing in. Okay, so you talked about Taylor Swift. I kind of have become a Swiftie, but have you followed it all? You know, everybody is, everybody always has dissected her lyrics, but the one that cracks me up is from "But Daddy, I Love Him." And so she said, "I'm having his baby," and everybody's thinking she's going to be talking about Travis. And then she goes, "No, I'm not, but you should see your faces," because she loves to watch people dissect her lyrics.
Mm.
And so she knew if she threw this in, she would get these like reactions of people going, ah. But I just thought, like, to your point, this whole, that to me is like very meta and very circular, right? Like she's writing lyrics, knowing people are going to react to them and dissect them. And then she can like turn it right back around and say,
Yeah.
I
It's
watched you
Glass
react
Onion.
to my lyrics. But
She's
Yeah,
a
I would
master. She's phenomenal.
genius, absolute genius, especially in that way. Like her understanding of how the community works, unbelievable.
and then it translates nicely too, right?
It does work out for her nicely, yes.
It sure does.
Yeah, I mean, she's a pioneer not in just music and songwriting, but in business and in self determination or taking your power.
Yeah, because it's been a while, and just even what she did with her own albums, like re-recording them and stuff, and all that.
Yeah.
But just the access to music that we can listen to whatever song we've ever heard and
Oh,
3 different
yeah.
remixes, and so can kids today. And I can
And
listen
if you
to
want
what
to
my
play it,
students
you
are
just
listening.
Google the chords and you play it.
But
Yeah.
that gets to your point too, what you're saying, Dave. The songs always existed, but they were paywall, so there was built-in scarcity. You had to buy the album and
scarcity,
then
yeah.
eventually the CD. Now with streaming, you just like holler over to Alexa and tell her what you want to hear, and in 2 seconds you get whatever you want.
I forget what Beatles song it was, but there's a story that Paul McCartney tells often about having to go across town to find the guy who knew how to make that proper B shape.
Mm.
And then he learned it from the guy, got back on the bus, went back and played it with the band. Like that's what there's the one guy who knows how to make, I don't know if it was a B7 or whatever it was, but there was one guy. So he had to go find that guy. Jimmy.
I do worry about AI's impact on the music
Oh
scene.
yeah,
Like, okay,
that's a whole. I
now
was
write a
gonna bring
Taylor
that up.
Swift song
Yeah.
about my lousy ex named
Sure.
whatever.
You guys seen
and
Suno?
Hmm?
Have you guys
Who?
tried Suno?
No.
tried it? No.
So you want to see the future of music? Go click on that, and where it says song description, put in the description of the song. It will write the song, make music for the song, and sing the song. Somebody sent me a song yesterday, Friday. He goes, I kind of feel like it's been like a whole week of Mondays. And he goes, I'm like, you should give us a little song, a little Manic Monday, a little Wish It Were Sunday. And when I was making a joke, whatever, it was just before the meeting started. And he goes, oh, and I see him do it in the background, and I get a message in the back channel where he just sent me a song called It's Been a Week of Mondays. And I played it, and it sounded like a song that was on the radio.
Wow.
Wow. So yes, Jeff, I am also concerned.
Yeah, I don't know. Like on what that's the good, the bad, and the ugly. I mean, in some ways, how well, okay, maybe I'm making too big a stretch here, but I remember when my sister, she had a degree in computer programming from, I don't even know what year, 82, let's say. And so when I started using WordPress, and I just would take plugins and throw them in, and I'd be like, I made a website, look at me. And she's like, you didn't make a website. Like you took this module Joe made in, wherever, Montana and whatever. And so like, I don't know, how much different is that than just saying, hey, I want this and this and this, and I got a song, I made a song. I don't know.
It just changes the definition of made,
Yeah.
right? There's a website that didn't exist before that Jennifer's responsible for, but she didn't start with a text editor, so it doesn't count.
My sister would say I never made a website in my life. Yeah.
Mm.
And it changes the literacies we need to use too, right? So
Yeah.
I was doing for the same creativity talk I was doing for the art school on Friday. I did a search for one of the image generating websites because I was trying to give them a sense of like different AI sort of stuff as it's working. And it was like woman on a horse who is riding on a beach in front of an ocean, whatever else. And I just used a random button and click. So it did. And you could pick the style, and it was like whatever the style was. so was a woman on a horse in a like a top. Their top was all a riding outfit and whatever else, but she's wearing no pants. Because inevitably, when you're searching through our understanding of women who are presented in these kinds of situations, they're not wearing pants on the internet.
I can
Which
totally
is the
relate.
problem with it, is that we're auto-generating, but we're replicating the internet, which is often a cesspool, particularly as it affects race and gender. So I think there's a bit difference.
But
That's
yeah,
the
and,
issue.
and I think going back to Taylor Swift, before her new album came out, there were all these fakes that did exactly what you just
That's
said,
right.
and then they were released as
Mhm.
her music, and then she's like, no, it wasn't. Well, that was easy because she's usually able to say that's not mine. But the question then becomes, what if we can't pinpoint what is and what isn't beyond a song, or if it's something really, really important, something that Biden said that started World War III, because we have a video of him saying something that took
And
us
I
down a
think
very
there'll
bad
still
path.
be a premium on the authentic, just like on Star Trek, people drink synthahol, but like, Guinan's always got a bottle of this real, Cardassian brandy or whatever. That's the real thing behind the bar. But people drink mostly synthahol, which scares me that we might be consuming. I'm sorry, it looks like you guys didn't get my Star Trek metaphor.
I got
I'm a
it.
little
I got
sad.
it.
Thank you.
Also,
Uh,
Scotty used to also drink
Right.
scotch. I was there with you.
I appreciate that. But most people drink the artificial stuff, and that may be the future of music.
No hangover.
But less flavor. All right. Anything else, Jen?
Nope.
Anything else, Dave?
Thank you very much for asking me such interesting questions. I appreciate the fact that you guys have managed to get it to chapter 2. I'm still suspicious whether or not Jen has read any of the other chapters and is reading them as she goes along.
One at a time.
But
Well, you don't want to
since
spoil the ending.
I have no memory. Like I said, I
That's right.
started looking at chapter 3, forgetting that we hadn't talked about chapter.
you're literally telling me about stuff I've written, and I'm like,
What did I say?
I did
Page
cite the page
44.
numbers. I put the page numbers in there for you so you can go
I
back.
appreciate that.
All right. Well, stay tuned for a post show because I have some questions.
I do too.
And tune in next week when we deal with chapter 3, how abundance is a problem for learning.